Hello there, kiddies. Welcome to another session of Sitting with Dr. Lob-EZ. Today we're going to be talking about, oh yeah, very exciting stuff, industrialization on continental Europe. All right. Let's see. First thing, catch your attention with that snazzy building located in London. It's called Crystal Palace. Crystal Palace was debuted in 1851 to show the world that Great Britain was the industrial and economic leader of not just Europe, but all the world. And this was a way for them to showcase many of the manufactured goods that came as a result of the Industrial Revolution. You might note that the building is constructed of glass and iron, the first of its kind. And this would go on to kind of set the standard for future buildings, not just in England, but in other parts of Europe and, of course, the Americas. Kind of looks like a mall to me. Obsolete buildings. At any rate, the, I guess, symbolism, as I mentioned, that it was, to showcase that they had become very mighty economically. The nickname for Great Britain at this time is the workshop of the world. All right. So make sure we understand and we remember that industrialization first begins in Great Britain in 1750. All right. So within 100 years, they had surpassed everybody else. Okay. We need to know that industrialization doesn't just stay confined to Great Britain. It spreads to the rest of Europe, the continent of Europe, in 1800. All right, and then shortly thereafter, making its way across the ocean to America. All right, but the result of not just the Industrial Revolution, but also the Agricultural Revolution, Great Britain's population and its wealth continues to grow. Okay, so that term GNP, Gross National Product, is an economic indicator to show the standard of living of, the population, the local power, the native population. All right, so we look at Great Britain with a growing population. All right, so what we want to do is discuss where the industrialization takes place next, where it spreads to. As I said, continental Europe. It's going to come first to Belgium, but not for a while. And the reason for the delay was the British were very secretive about their, ways in which they manufactured goods. And so there were very strict laws against industrial espionage. But there was also a tremendous amount of chaos taking place on the continent of Europe, first starting with the French Revolution and then following that with the Napoleonic Wars. Okay, that doesn't mean that industrialization doesn't take place at all, but that certainly limits it. Okay, so what this does is it gives Great Britain a tremendous head start, and by the time the other countries of Europe begin industrializing, the head start that the British has is very difficult to overcome. Okay, so their products are superior, their technology is superior, and the prices are better. More better, right? More better. Okay, but and as time goes on, the more complicated that manufacturing becomes, the more expensive it is to manufacture these goods, and it's very difficult for these European countries to play catch up. But because there's money to be made, there are going to be those people who are willing to take the risks, all right, because they want to get paid. All right. So here we have a picture, I think it's about 1850, of industrialization. All right. So obviously it's fully underway in Great Britain, but also here in Northern Europe. Okay. And the first country, as I said, was Belgium, and then the next one will be Prussia, all right, one of the largest Germanic states, all right, which the Germanic people have already expressed an interest to become united And so when we look at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, you have the Congress of Vienna. One of the things that they stipulate in the peace treaty is they want to prevent future continental wars, specifically France, from attacking its neighbors. So what they did was they strengthened the neighbors of France, and that would be with the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine, and that was a defensive alliance of some 38 Germanic states designed to prevent an aggressor from attacking them. Okay, and so Prussia was one of the largest members of the Germanic Confederation. Also Austria. All right, but Austria is not gonna. They're gonna miss the boat on this. All right, as far as industrialization and other things are concerned. Okay, so we need to discuss where and how it takes place as far as industrialization on the continent. Okay, so as Belgium's first country to industrialize, and that process begins in 1799 when a Englishman by the name of William Cockerell decides to risk, punishment to bring his ideas to Belgium. Okay, and he does so, as I said, 1799. And what he and his son create is basically an industrial empire. And as a result of that, it's going to continue and it's going to grow. Okay. And so I like to think of if Great Britain is the workshop of the world, I like to think of Belgium as the little engine that could, because although it's a small country, size-wise and population size, it's very rich in terms of natural resources. Okay, and the natural resources necessary really for industrialization to take place is going to be coal and iron, all right, because of the steam engine. Okay, the steam engine, you need both, all right. To make it, you need iron. To fuel it, to power it, you need coal. Okay, and so there's plenty of that in Belgium, and as a result, Belgium stakes its claim and becomes known as a very powerful industrial country. All right, and they are right next door to the Netherlands. Now, the Netherlands, they've grown wealthy, but for another reason, and that is trade, overseas trade. So there's a lot of banking, there's a lot of merchant companies, and they have a very large fleet for that purpose, but they're different, okay? Now, just a side note, the Congress of Vienna, in its infinite wisdom, has decided to merge both, I guess what would be called the Dutch Republic with with Belgium, all right? They had been united once before, but had since split, and there's a reason for it. There's division, there's differences. The type of people, the Belgians and the Dutch, they're not the same. They different language. The Belgians speak French, the Dutch speak German, and Dutch is a Germanic language, and religiously they're different, and economically they're different as well. But anyway, he brings it to Belgium. All right, and as a result, it has now spread. Now, as I said, there were a lot of laws that were passed to prevent that from happening, but you can't lock down an entire country. You can't prevent people from leaving. All right, we'll see later on. The Germans try to do that when they divide East and West Germany, specifically Berlin. It's very difficult to keep people in, all right? And that's just a city. Consider a country the vast size of England. There's so many different ways for people to get out. Not that they were preventing people from leaving, but they were trying to prevent people from leaving with industrial plans. Okay, so that's that. Now, the second person to bring industrialization, and this is the German Fritz Harcourt, who brings it to Prussia, all right? And he uses the land that had been recently acquired by Prussia, again by the Congress of Vienna, to strengthen Austria, to prevent France and others from attacking to kind of bolster their size to create a balance of power in Europe. And so they had been granted from France the Ruhr Valley. And this Ruhr Valley is extremely important to Germany, okay, and to the entire industrialization process that's taking place in the Germanic Confederation, all right? Some of the challenges that he has, difficulty getting skilled workers, as everyone had, because they didn't grow on trees. Nobody had the experience. You had to entice workers to come from England, and the parts to build the factories, to build the machinery, also quite difficult and very expensive. And even though he had some initial success, the importance of talking about Harcourt is that many people fail. Right? Entrepreneurs have to be prepared to risk everything and many times lose. And so he is a painful reminder of the risks associated with this. Okay? When we take a look at other continental countries, nearby is France. You might think, and let me just back up here, and if we look at this map here, you can see how, while this map isn't the best, the one with your study guide definitely shows that there were natural resources present, coal and iron, plentiful in France. So the reason for France not industrializing is not because they're economically backwards, like many of the southern and eastern European countries. They had a relatively robust economy, and many of their manufactured goods were done by hand, and they had really created a niche market in the luxury items, going all the way back to the heyday of Versailles under the reign of Louis XIV. They developed this reputation of creating the finest luxury items. Okay, so they learned how to make silk, porcelain, which were Chinese secrets, and they were able to reproduce those, and perfumes, wines, tapestries, and lace as a textile. And I guess the sophistication of those did not lend itself very well to being automated through machines. So they didn't industrialize quite as rapidly as some of their European neighbors, okay, especially Belgium. But they do, but it's, again, not because of being economically backwards. And then we need to look at why, okay? Great Britain had an advantage. They had that head start. They had the experience, but where there's a will, there's a way. And where the real success lies is because governments get involved. Because of the large, advantage and head start that the British have, in order to kind of close that, governments have to get involved. All right, and so in these Western European states, they get themselves involved. How do they do that? Well, establishing tariffs. Okay, so introducing some mercantilistic policies to protect their developing industries. They're going to place tariffs on any imports coming from other countries. So that's going to, protect them from competition. The government will also subsidize road building, infrastructure, primarily canals, roads, bridges, and most especially railroads. Many of these were privately funded enterprises in Great Britain. That you can make a fortune from it, but the government didn't kick in, and that's the advantage. I guess this is what is going to help them catch up. So that's a way in which, or a couple of ways in which the government was assisting industrialization. Another right here, the Prussians introduced was if people had invested in railroads and the money that they had invested wasn't seeing the kind of return that they wanted, the government would subsidize that and pay the interest so that it would encourage people to continue investing, private investors. All right, so it was kind of some government support, but that didn't mean that private people weren't allowed to invest in factories. So those are the ways in which government did that. Now, speaking of tariffs, we want to take a look at Prussia, not just Prussia, but all of the Germanic Confederation. All right, this gentleman here, Friedrich List, who is a journalist, felt that it was very important to the German people to industrialize. He felt very strongly that if the German people did not industrialize, it would be to their great peril. And he saw a connection between wealth and poverty and being industrialized and not being industrialized. So the connection is, you want to gain wealth and be prosperous as a nation, you must industrialize. And to not do that would be to... Okay, so talking about Friedrich List and his strong belief, and his writings discuss the importance of industrializing, and he sees industrialization as a way to end poverty for the Germanic people. And it was, most of the Germanic states, they're economically were agrarian, and the standard of living was relatively low. Okay, and so he encourages a unification of the German lands. Now, he's not the only one that wanted. There were a lot of romantic and nationalistic authors who felt similarly, but he wanted to do so for economic reasons. And he was instrumental in the creation of customs unions in the Germanic states, and the most important of which was the Zollverein. All right, and so what that does is it takes all Germanic states that had been linked up by the the defensive alliance that they had created with the Germanic Confederation, and this is economic cooperation and unification. The country, though, it should be noted, that is not a part of the Zollvereins is Austria. All right. They are not interested in doing so. They believe that is not what that they believed in a little bit more economic liberalism. But anyway, so free trade zones within. All right. So you have all of these interconnected, that are neighbors, Germanic states. Why not allow the free flow of goods back and forth? All right, that's only going to encourage more economic growth. Okay, so what about tariffs, though? Well, yeah, anybody else that's not part of the Germanic Zollverein, they would be, heavily taxed with. They want to bring any goods in. All right, so that was the deal. Banks play an important role of industrialization. You need banks because they're a source of money, not just to start up, but as you go on. They extend a line of credit. You want to make an improvement. You get a loan from the bank to do so. All right. You want to expand or what have you. So the creation of limited liability corporations, LLCs, that's something that had been around for a while, but extending that to banks, that designation, so that people could invest in banks. And if the bank should fail because of some risky investments, you would only be out your initial investment. You wouldn't lose or you wouldn't be on the hook for the financial losses of the bank, just what you invested. So, because previously banks were known for being very conservative with their investments, and they, would only invest in those things that they knew would bring a return. So there's no guarantee with these brand new factories that are opening. It's very risky, but that extra layer of insulation is what is enough to encourage banks to extend loans to more and more people. All right, so that was extremely important and attractive to the investors. All right, so we see similar, this starts in Belgium and then it spreads to France and the other Germanic lands. And so we see, this very interesting mix between private sources of money, governmental sources of money, and then kind of going between would be the money that the banks provide as well. So there's a lot of things that are going on. All right. Want to talk about the importance of two classically or laissez-faire economists, Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo, very much along the same lines of Adam Smith in regards to liberalism, economic liberalism, but they had a very pessimistic outlook on life in Europe, and they believed that the continent rather, was kind of doomed to mass starvation, and they saw it. Their evidence was based on the growing population on one hand, and what they believed to be the limited ability of farms and farming innovations to match the demand for food that a growing population represents. Okay, very wrong-headed in that regard, because they're just saying it right now. Their predictions did not come to pass because technology found a way, and they were able to keep up with the food. The food supply was able to keep up with the population. But Thomas Malthus, what you got to know about him is his essay on the principle of population said that the population would outstrip the food supply. All right, and essentially he said this is going to create more human misery. All right, mass starvation. And so the only hope for mankind is some type of, they actually thought war was good because it helped keep populations down, but they thought people should, not get married until much later in life, because they believed that if people Malthus and others, and also David Ricardo, that if people had excess money, instead of using it to improve the quality of their life by making purchases on consumer items, they're going to have more children, right? So this belief that people will just continually reproduce and have more offspring, and therefore that's going to keep people in an impoverished state, all right? And so David Ricardo takes it one step further and basically says that there is this iron law of wages, that wages will be held down over time. There may be some fluctuation along the way, and that will be due to wages. So basically it goes like this. Population begins to rise. There is a tremendous supply of workers. So what does that do to wages as the population goes down? Well, increased supply of workers means wages are going to drop. Okay, and what will happen is the population will begin to come down because people will have fewer children. So as population goes down, wages will begin to climb, all right, because there's less of a supply of workers, right? So the demand for workers goes up, thus that brings wages up. And that you're just going to have this throughout time, this back and forth, all right, with population and wages. And basically both of these guys have a very kind of harsh look that they basically look at it like this. Human misery is going to be increased by a growing population, so we should really do nothing to help poor people survive or help them have more children. So actually, any kind of public assistance is dangerous, because if you give that money to them, they're not going to use it to improve the quality of their life. They're just going to figure, hey, we can have more children. Let's reproduce. All right. So kind of viewing people kind of like rodents and their ability to procreate at a very rapid rate. Okay. So that's the iron law of wages. But, that kind of pessimistic thinking is why economics is known as the dismal science, right down here. Okay, so at this point, our conversation takes us to factory workers, right? And the way in which families were still tied together as an economic unit. So the term working class, we need to be familiar with what that means. Okay, working class really doesn't mean anything today. It means it could be, I guess, poor, like, or lower middle class today, that like the way that we view the class system. The working class just meant people who, whether they were skilled or unskilled, they worked for a living. Middle class people were usually the highly professional, highly educated people, very successful business people. And then the upper class, that was the leisure class. Those were typically the nobility. All right, but the working class is a new term that is coined to kind of include this group of people who are not peasants. That they're not making their living through farming. Okay, they're wage earners. They work for a living. Okay. So there's lots of different ways in which we describe who these people are. I mean, they, still in England at this time, about 50% of the population still made their living through farming, but what about everybody else? Well, people worked in factories, people worked in domestic service as servants for the wealthy, and there are some trends, there are some things that are worth noting. Okay, because of the growth of factories, families, at least initially, families were able to stay together and work together for long hours, 10, 12 hours. And we see the importance of families sticking together, not just, a biological family, but extended families. And what I mean is immigration or migration throughout Great Britain and beyond. Ireland, for example, some of the economic problems that they've had historically were exacerbated in the mid-century because of the potato famine, which we'll talk about shortly. But they, as a way to improve their lot in life, they moved, and many of them came and they settled in areas where there were other Irish, and they kind of helped each other out, and so that kind of created a extended family, for lack of a better term. But getting back to the factories and the way that adults, the father would speak to and like arrange for his family to work at a factory, and he was kind of the go-between, the factory manager and his family. He would instruct his family what to do, and even though they worked very long hours, the family was together, and so that made it, I guess, manageable. But what we'll start to see is through some reforms that and the changes because of new technology, that was no longer required. The men were seen as more skilled in the textile industries, and with the advent of newer machinery, these men weren't required, and so the family begins to be broken up as an economic unit, and the factories primarily, the textile mills specifically, primarily went women and children because they can pay them less. I mean, and so when that happens, we start to see people object to child labor, and it's not until the family is broken up as an economic unit that people really begin to complain about child labor. All right, that's not the only thing that was a concern and identified as needing change or reform. There were other areas, but it was primarily the workplace. Okay, Robert Owen, who we've already mentioned, was one of the utopian socialists. He was a very successful factory owner in Scotland, and he was encouraged to testify before Parliament, and he gives his opinion that child labor is not just bad for children, but it's also bad for the factory owner. There were a lot of people who gave those types of talks, and we start to see momentum begin to build for changes. Okay, now it's interesting because at this time there really isn't a lot of political will to do that, because if you look here, only about 8%, even though it's a constitutional monarchy, a very small amount of percentage of people are allowed to vote. We're just talking men. Women aren't allowed to vote. Okay, only about 8% of the population can vote. But it's interesting, despite that small percentage, Parliament does begin to reform the workplace. Okay, kind of interesting. Kind of interesting how that happens. So we'll kind of take you through that. All right. So French Revolution comes along, and because of the chaos associated with it, all the elites in Great Britain, the wealthy landowners, the gentry class, the nobility, they don't want any part of any kind of reform. They don't want any kind of enlightenment or anything like that. They want the status quo. They don't want to upset that at all. All right? But something happens with the creation of a tariff, okay, known as the Corn Laws. You may remember there was the Continental System under Napoleon where they tried to force all of Europe to boycott British-made goods. Well, the British respond with the implementation of a tariff to France, primarily through Corn Laws. All right, what are Corn Laws? Well, it's a misnomer, first off. It has nothing to do with corn. It has to do with cereal crops like wheat or barley or oats. Okay, and so there was a tariff on foreign-produced cereal crops. So after the Napoleonic Wars had come to a close, Napoleon's gone, there were many in British society who wanted to get rid of the tariff system. All right, but there were those, primarily the large landowners, who didn't want that because they made more money. Because that created a shortage. And that meant everyone had to purchase cereal crops from the large landowners. And not only that, because there was less of a supply, the prices were higher, right? And so there was no incentive for them to get rid of the Corn Laws, and because they're primarily the big decision makers in Parliament, there's not much going to happen initially, 1815, all right? So what ends up happening is unrest, okay? There are protests, there are demonstrations, and Parliament attempts to, need to note here, it's important to know, all of the chaos, all of the revolutions that take place on continental Europe do not happen in England. Great Britain is saved from most of that chaos, but they have a very, very close call here. It's about to happen, all right? So because of the demonstrations, Parliament passes laws basically taking away due process rights and freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and things like that, trying to quell the uprising. Well, it doesn't happen, all right? Those laws that they pass restricting those types of movements do not sit well with the people, all right? And so there is a massive protest in Manchester, England, which is kind of, we'll talk about them later, but they're kind of the held out there as the example of everything that's wrong with industrialization in a urban setting. There is a response by the government to put down very savagely this uprising or this protest, and thousands of people are slaughtered. Okay, and that event is known as the Battle of Peterloo. Right. What this does is, I guess, gets everybody's attention, even the elites, and they realize that this was way too heavy-handed, and that perhaps they should be a little bit more open to some kinds of reform. So that is enough for people in power to kind of do some self-reflection, look and say, well, maybe we need to, consider this, because this could get worse. This could just be the beginning. This could be the first shot. This could be the storming of the Bastille. There could be a whole lot more bloodshed left. So perhaps we should introduce some reforms. Okay, and so that's what starts happening. Okay, and what ends up happening is actually very lucky, if you will. The two main political parties within Parliament, the Whigs and the Tories, see an opening here. They see the more that they're willing, because that's what the public wants right now, is they want reform. So the more willing they are to give the kinds of reforms that the people want, the more likely their party will be the dominant party, right? And so the Tories and the Whigs are in a competition with one another to gain political support. So they're willing to kind of outbid each other when it comes to introducing reform type legislation. All right. And I think that's very similar to what we have with our political parties today. Political parties, politicians at election time, we just got through an election cycle. They tell you whatever they think you want to hear, oftentimes, many times. All right. And so that's part of it. That's kind of part of why England reforms itself. And that's also why there's no revolution within that country. All right. So the House of Commons becomes a very powerful part of Parliament, and from there, eventually, suffrage rights begins to grow. All right, slowly, right, until we get to universal male suffrage, but that's still 50 years away. Okay. So it slowly, begins to grow, and that it's going to continue to grow from there, because what do people want? They want the right to vote. How do you gain popularity? By giving the people what they want. All right, and there's this idea too that it's morally good to give people the right to vote, because things have changed. Instead of seeing people as mobs and ignorant nincompoops, they begin to see people as the source of doing what's best, and that we should naturally then give people the right to vote, because with democracy, you can never go wrong. That's perhaps naive, but yeah, that was the belief system. All right. So one of the things that we want to look at is this part of this reform is this Sadler Commission, because what they do is they investigate child labor and just working conditions in general all across England. In Manchester and in all the other industrial cities, they're looking at all sorts of things, but primarily the conditions in mines, because they were very dangerous, and then also what was happening to the children. All right, and the first-hand accounts of people, workers who were called in, and their thoughts were written down, their reports, the working conditions were given, and that creates the impetus for the Factory Act of 1833, which, if you look at it, really doesn't do a whole lot. It reduces the working hours a little bit, but you can just see how bad things would have, were prior to this. All right, so those aged 9 to 13 can work no more than 48 hours a week. Kind of crazy. Those 14 to 18 can only work up to 70 hours a week. All right, so crazy. But one of the things that we want to look at is the drawbacks. This idea of child labor laws means families can't work together because children are prohibited. All right, so that's part of it as well. Out of this movement grows the Chartist movement, and this is the desire, as I kind of mentioned, to increase voting rights. All right, so the Chartist movement begins to push. Not only it's going on simultaneously with the push for workplace reform, but also to extend suffrage rights, voting rights to more people. All right, they see complete democracy and rule by the common people as the best formula. What I will say is it doesn't work. All right, Parliament rejects every time they push for it, because that's what they wanted. They wanted universal suffrage, and every time they pushed for it, the country wasn't ready for it, so it failed. They also wanted, the Chartist movement wanted, and this sounds strange, but they wanted people who were in Parliament to be paid, because it's a full-time position. They should be paid. Well, okay, who doesn't need to get paid? Those people who already have money, and that would be the leisure class. That was a way, that's what they wanted. If people can actually make a living by serving in government, then that would open it up to those people who have to work for a living. I mean, if you have to work for a living, well, you certainly can't serve in Parliament. All right, so that was another goal or wish for the Chartist movement. All right, and I don't know if that says that in the notes, so make sure you got that. One of the other events that really begins to kind of change things would be the potato famine, the Great Famine. That's really from 1845 to 1851. That creates a lot of change. First with the Corn Laws, but then also with voting rights and things like that. Okay, as you already know from previous units, the Irish lived almost completely and solely on potatoes. Right? Well, as a result of the introduction of the potato, the Irish population grows, right? Doubles to about 5 million people, right? And so when the potato blight takes place, it just devastates the whole country, because that's what pretty much everybody that lives there are poor farmers. It's an agrarian society. The only people that have any wealth, or most of them, are English, and they're landowners, right? So the people suffer desperately, right? Those that can emigrate do. They come to the United States, or they go to Great Britain, or they go over to England. But it leaves more than 1 million people dead, right? Which is devastating to the actual percentages of the overall population, right? Okay, so really, I guess the question that we need to look at is, what does all this have to do? Okay, so we've got different things happening at one time. You have the famine taking place, and this call to repeal the Corn Laws by Parliament, because it's seen as the wealthy and very greedy rich people are starving the Irish. Okay, so they got to get rid of laws that protect these wealthy people that don't need the protection. All right, so there's a little bit of class warfare going on in England, but out of this, there are people, well-intentioned, well-meaning Christian people who believe that they have an obligation to help the poor, and that by extension, not just them, but the government is morally obligated to do something to take care of the Irish that are coming to their country. They got to feed them. Okay, so along those same lines, if we have a moral obligation to improve the misery that people are suffering from because of a famine, does that same support and obligation to help people also extend to helping people in the workplace, and passing laws that will reform it to make the average working family and working man have time to spend with his family? And the answer to that is yes. And so we also see the passage of the 10-Hour Act. Well, that makes sense. Okay, so if we're going to help the poor, we should help the working class people as well. Well, what about the Chartist movement? Even though it doesn't succeed, they don't get universal male suffrage, it does, because again, they kind of see the rich as kind of the enemy. Well, let's embolden, or let's empower then those people who can do a good job of kind of being the watchdog of the wealthy. And even though we're not going to give the vote to the poor, who will take care of the poor? Who will watch after the poor? Who will be the guardians poor? And that's the middle class. And so that's where the voting bloc expands. It's within the middle class. Hopefully, I think it does. So let's move on. Yeah, that social question. Is it society? Is it the state's role or responsibility for caring for its citizens? All right, so another phenomenon that takes place, children are leaving the workplace, and so we are seeing a sexual division of labor, meaning women and men are no longer working together. All right, doing the same types of jobs. They used to work as a family, but now they're not. Factory owners want women and children because they can pay them less. Well, now you can't employ children. Well, we can employ women. And then what about the men? Well, the men are being employed in positions that have higher skill, whether they're still a craftsman or they're moving up the ladder in the factory and becoming a manager or foreman. What we start to see is that women, once married and having children, don't need to work anymore. All right. And so a new standard is created. Women always worked on the farm. I mean, even when there was the cottage industry, the women did their part. They might have had this is a woman's job, the spinning of the thread, but they still worked. And when it was farm, time for harvest, the women went out there and they did their fair share as well. But when it comes to work, like not having a job to do per se, that starts in the mid 1800s in England and then the rest of continental Europe, and basically it's because the men made enough. They made enough money to support their wives, so their wages were high enough so the women could stay home. And the job of running a house back then, a household back then with no modern appliances and no transportation, was an extremely difficult job. So imagine, if you will, a woman working 12 hours a day and having to come home and feed her family. And I mean, she's got to pluck a chicken and she's got to skin the doggone thing and cook it and, pull out all the guts and then clean the house and do this and do that and watch the children. Who's going to watch the children too? Because there's not compulsory education and the state's not paying for it. So what are you going to do with the children? It used to be that the women, they'd take their children with them. They'd tie them up or do the swaddling, or have the kids work with them. Well, now the kids can't work, and the jobs are so, at the factories, the machinery is so complex that women can't leave their children untended. They have to attend to them. So it's kind of a mess. What do? We have to stay home. So there was that, the nature of it. So we want to look at basically what the deal is. All right. So the only time we saw women of the working class that didn't work, of that social class, the working class, the only time we saw married women doing that is when their husbands were dead, hurt, left, drunk, whatever. That didn't mean that women didn't work. Women did work. If they were widows, obviously, but single women worked, saved up money until they got married. And the hope was eventually they could stay home and then they could raise the children. That could be the focus. And this really, really, really kind of coincides with Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Emile and, this idea of separate spheres. That is a woman, because of her natural instincts to be motherly, she's better suited to be, the primary caregiver to children. Okay? So that creates this new, they call it sexual division of labor, but it's the new standard. Okay? So I've discussed some of the challenges, if a woman was going to work once she was married and had children, it just really decreased the number of women who did work. All right. So that is going to be the standard for the next 100 years, that women, stay home in westernized European or just Western civilization. Okay. When there were women, who did work, obviously, as I said, there were certain types of jobs that were women's work, whether that was, working in the textile industry or not. There were just certain things that they didn't do. Okay. One of the interesting things was that women did work in the mines. Okay. Women worked down in the coal mines, and as did children. And because of the intense heat associated with working underground, it was very commonplace for the workers to nearly strip. All right. And so this was seen as not a good situation for males and females to be working side by side, half naked. That would invite some kind of immoral behavior. All right, so little horizontal mambo, if you catch my drift. So that was something that the middle class reformers were offended by, and that's one of the reasons why they said no women working underground in the mines, because we can't see and watch what they're up to. And there is some legitimacy to that claim, because there was illegitimacy explosion too. So it's not like that didn't happen. But there were also those who said women should not be made to work under these types of conditions. Now, these pictures, I think they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. I think it kind of, speaks to not just the travails of women, but also these poor children being that's not a ride at an amusement park that they're being hoisted up from the mines. Okay, so Mines Act of 1842 prohibit underground work for women and girls as well as for boys under 10. All right, some women were offended because they have a right to work and now they can't. But most women, when it came to mining, they didn't want any part of it. And that's what the law prohibited women from mining. And so, they just didn't want to do it because of just how dangerous it was, how horrible it was. That's not a job that people enjoy for the most part, is being miners. You gotta offer a pretty attractive compensation to work underground, and they did. They made, for women, they were probably the highest paid women miners, but for them, it just wasn't worth it for the most part. All right. One other thing, another reason why, this is the last one, we're going to move on. Women did not work was because that became the kind of standard for middle class. Middle class women didn't do that, right? Because they wanted to emulate the upper class, right? The idle leisure class. So if the middle class isn't working and you're the working class, you want to emulate them. So you want to dress like them, but you also want to do what they do. And if they don't work, then I guess women shouldn't have to work with the working class. And that created that was the social pressure, I guess, to not work. All right. So that's the case. All right. So that speaks to people's growing sense of class consciousness. And that's something that. All right. Really quickly, want to discuss some of the some of the trends with regards to the factory owners. Not all factory owners were like Ebenezer Scrooge. Many of them were self-made men. They worked hard. They were smart. They took some chances. They took their money. They didn't. I guess the part of like Scrooge being miserly, that might be true, but they basically just didn't want to blow what they had created. They didn't want to live high on the hog and waste all the money that they had gotten. There was some religious reasons for that as well, but they just thought that it made good business sense to hold on to your money, because you never know when you're going to have to reinvest it back into your company. All right, and they weren't mean. They didn't want to necessarily abuse. This is just a trend. This is there obviously are exceptions, but as it being the majority, we say it's safe to kind of make these assumptions. They wanted to not necessarily make their employees wealthy, but they saw that they were lifting people out of poverty by giving them a job and helping them make a living. That they were providing a service just like the employee was providing a service to them. It was very mutually beneficial. Okay. So, that's those are some of the trends. Now, when it comes to having children, they didn't necessarily want their children to follow in their line of work by working through the factory. They wanted them to receive a formal education and study those things, business or what have you, at a university, and then perhaps use those skills to help, propel the family business, into its next phase. They didn't like the government really meddling in their affairs, because this is something that they built, and they didn't want government regulation to really, interfere with that. So, some of them didn't, approve of laws against child labor. All right. Some liked having children working for them because they could pay them less, but some of them just opposed those types of restrictions because they just didn't want government telling them what to do. So there's a little of both going on. All right. So talk very quickly about the British labor movement. And what I mean by that is like organized labor unions. All right. It's kind of there's a couple of events that we want to take a look at. All right. So look at the year 1799. All right. Parliament passes the Combination Acts, which outlaw unions and strikes. Right. Well, you know, there were those in society who believed in laissez-faire economics, so that means no government interference. And there were also those who were watching what happened over in France with the Revolution. And to them, workers coming together and protesting and going on strike is no different than just regular people doing the same thing for political reasons. So they didn't differentiate, and so Parliament passed the Combination Acts, which outlawed unions and strikes. But just make sure you understand that it doesn't work, all right? For the most part, people ignore it, and it doesn't take long before Parliament repeals it, all right? Basically, unions in England are conservative, and they're not proponents of violence, and they're not super radical in their beliefs. They just simply want to improve the lives of workers. And so for the most part, the unions that do survive aren't calling for anything crazy. They're not calling for the overthrow of government, because there are those countries and there are unions that have anarchists in it and, you know, socialists that want to just, you know, change everything, or communists even. And they want, you know, violence. Not in England for the most part. And they were legitimate labor unions, you know, men, hard workers that just wanted to, you know, improve the quality of their life. All right. We've already talked about Ludism before, so I don't think I need to mention that too much. But the Combination Acts are repealed. All right. There was a movement, there was an attempt to create a universal labor union in England. So no matter who you were, whether you were skilled or unskilled, you had a right to be represented by a labor union. That effort fails. The people who have the true leverage are skilled workers, because they can threaten to go on strike, and if they go on strike, they can't be easily replaced because they're skilled labor. Whereas unskilled laborers, they go on strike, they can be easily replaced. So there was a lot more backlash against the creation of those types of unions for people who were unskilled. And the guy who kind of led that movement but ultimately failed is, again, Robert Owen. And he wanted to create what was known as the Grand National Consolidated Trades Union. But his scheme failed. All right. So labor movement within England was limited to primarily those people who were part of, like, considered skilled craftsmen. Okay? So, again, being pretty conservative. All right. Chartism, the Chartist Movement, was associated with violence, and that's because there was an uprising on the continent of Europe in 1848, and so the Chartist movement kind of dies out because of its affiliation with that type of agitation. All right. Okay, we're on the home stretch here, kids. So we want to talk about urbanization and the challenges associated with it and the ways that they were, you know, dealt with. Cities have been around since the Middle Ages, and we know that because of overcrowding, the bubonic plague was able to, and the lack of sanitation, just create a crisis. So that's nothing new, disease and things like that. And the ignorance associated with what causes diseases, that was still the problem in the mid-19th century, all right, all the way up until the end of the the latter half of the 19th century, okay? But the cities that we start to see are much more overcrowded than they ever have been in the past, and that's because that's where factories are located. Factories are located there because it's convenient. Some factories kind of are created, and towns are the byproduct because that's where people show up because there are jobs. So it's kind of like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? What came first, the city or the factory? Well, here's the problem in England, though. They had if a place wasn't called a city, it was very difficult and time consuming to be granted that designation of being called a city. And if they're not called a city, then they get no representation in Parliament and no way to improve it. No government assistance, nobody within the city working to make life better for its inhabitants. And so pretty much anything goes in cities early on. Crime is rampant. Building, the way building codes non-existent. So homes could be, shoddily constructed. They could be right on top of each other. There could be, fire hazards. Fires erupted, and there were no limitations on how many people lived in a domicile. And then, as far as sanitation goes, all these humans living in, tight confines, and there's not enough clean water, there's not enough fresh drinking water, there's not enough water to bathe with, and then what do you do with human waste? And it was everywhere. Human waste was everywhere, and it doesn't take a genius to figure out that disease was right on the heels of all of that, right? And so by mid-century, the country of England has to deal with this major problem, all right? And so Parliament has to change their rules and start granting these places city status so that they can direct resources to improve them, all right? So there was some pushback against that because the British didn't want to do that because they saw that was too similar to the way that things operated on continental Europe, and they saw themselves as probably a little bit better than that, and so they were resistant. But it had reached critical mass. There was just way too many problems, disease, death that were being caused, and once people start to shine the light on just how bad and expose this problem and begin writing about it, that changes take place. But the way that the cities, were set up, the poor people lived in the middle, and that was the most highly concentrated population-wise, and people were packed in like sardines. And things kind of got a little bit better as you moved out, and the rich, the wealthy, they lived on the outskirts of town, so they didn't have to deal with all of those problems. All right, but yeah, waste disposal, the privy, that was a huge mess. Being able to deal with human waste, where to take it, and how to get rid of it. That was because it was causing diseases. All right. So the last part here is how they clean this up. Public health, urban reformers. Edwin Chadwick, he's the guy that you need to know. And he is responsible for issuing a report to Parliament that deals with sanitation. Actually, he was tasked by Parliament to do a study on poverty. And he really looked at cleaning up the cities as far as the filth and the hygiene of the people and sanitation was concerned. He saw that as a remedy to poverty, because what happens when you have all of this filth? Well, people get sick and they die. Well, what happens to the family members if the father dies? Well, they're impoverished, and so he saw sanitation as a remedy for poverty. Okay, and so his reports lead to some very major changes, not to mention the cholera epidemic that breaks out all over England, and people are dying by the tens of thousands, that finally it forces government to act. And the Public Health Act of 1848 implements sanitation, where you have pipes that are transporting human waste and using water and things like that. And making sure building codes that homes are safe, and there's limitations, and there's regulations on all of these things. So these types of things really go a long way of improving the standard of living and the quality of life for people in these urban areas. It starts in England, and then as does everything, spreads to the rest of Europe. All right, that's it.